Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Learn for series, the team series, and welcome to Unit 3. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So could I just ask people to type into the question box whether or not just write clear, because that will let me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. We can sometimes have audio problems. Thanks, Denise. I appreciate that. Clear, Captain Tim, says Chelsea. Loud and clear. Thank you. Great. Excellent, Catherine. Thank you. Right. Okay. All good, says Chris. Great. Hi, Chris. Welcome. Thanks, Jenny. Welcome, Jenny. Okay. All good. So let's get underway and look at this module. So look, I've had some really great feedback. Thank you very much for those that have given me feedback. It kind of adds a degree of assurance that I'm doing the right thing. So hopefully what you've been able to do is to apply some of the things that you've learned. I mean, that's the key thing out of all of these sorts of learning experiences. Is it really about applying what you've learned? So that's the key thing. But by all means, keep the questions coming through the next hour as we go through this module. And of course, you will receive a copy of the presentation, both in slide format and also video, at the conclusion of this. Not this afternoon, probably tomorrow, because I've got a full day today, but you'll certainly be getting that over the weekend. All right, so let's get into the topic of tools for leading teams. And just before I do that, let's just go back and review where we've been and where we're going. So you'll notice there that we've looked at, initially we looked at the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. And the whole purpose of that, of course, was to give you an opportunity to start to look at your own teams and to consider some of the things that you could do to improve the performance of the team. And my point was not to really bombard you with too much information, but rather give you a kind of like a model or a framework for you to go away and pick 1 or 2 areas and start working on those. And the good news is if you work on 1 or 2 of those characteristics, it's likely to impact positively on the other characteristics. 2 weeks ago, we went through Module 2, which was the four stages of team development using Attackman's model. And really what I wanted you to do there is to have a look at your own team and work out what stage of maturity your team was in, and then perhaps to use some leadership skills that were appropriate to that stage to move the team on to the next phase. So we're going to continue that a little bit more today with the tools of leading, and I won't go through the other 3 modules because we'll do that in due course. So tools for leading. So what are we really looking at today? Well, before we go launching into that, let's just remind ourselves of what the Attackman model was all about. And you would be aware, of course, there were 4 stages of group or team development: forming, storming, norming, and performing. So the whole purpose of this was to give us a little bit of a framework to be able to move our team on to the next stage. And I gave you some characteristics around the stages, and I also suggested to you that there were certain things that you needed to do in order to move the team on to the next stage. So I hope you had a little bit of opportunity of observing your team in that regard, and I hope you've been able to at least identify what stage the team is, generally speaking, and perhaps to think a little bit more about how you might move that team on to the next stage in development. So that was really what the last unit was all about. And you might find that your team is in transition between one stage and another, which I didn't really mention too much last time. And so if you're finding it's a little difficult to determine which stage you could classify your team in, it may well be because it's in transition between one stage and another. But nevertheless, the homework, of course, was to, try and move the team on to the next stage. So are there any final questions about that before we launch into the topic today? Because if there is, go for your life. Otherwise, we'll just continue. Okay, doesn't look like it. That's fine. All right, so what are we going to look at today? Now, the theme of today is really around you being able to adjust your team style, if you like, to be flexible enough for the circumstances you're in. So what it means is that different tasks and different people require different types of leadership styles. So I'm going to throw a bunch of models at you today to give you a sense of what options you've got open to you in terms of how you lead a team and in what circumstances you might decide to use those options. The big theme about today is that you've got two key things that you've got to look after as a team leader. Obviously, you're there because there is a certain function or task that has to be done. And there's also a whole series of relationships that have got to be managed as well. So as you can see, point one on the slide there, the first thing we're going to look at is this whole concept of task versus relationship and the fact that you've got to keep those two balls juggling in the air. But in certain circumstances, it might be more of a task focus, and in other cases, it might be more a relationship focus. And so a lot of the models use the themes of task versus relationship. So I'm going to talk about that today. That's going to be a key aspect of what we're covering, a key theme, if you like. So really the key thing about today is that you need to be flexible. You need to try different approaches depending on what it is that you're trying to lead, that is, what the task is that you're trying to actually accomplish, and also where people are in terms of their level of maturity. So there is some linkage between what we're covering today and what we did a fortnight ago. And I'm going to finish up with probably the most famous model in relation to situational leadership. In fact, they call it situational leadership, which is the model I'm going to share with you at the end. So really, your homework is going to be around being flexible or more flexible in terms of how you deal with circumstances that you face in your team. And that'll take us through, of course, to the end of the hour. All right, so that's where we're going. So fasten your seatbelts, and it's probably in a lot of cases, if you're on the east coast of Australia, it's probably not quite lunchtime yet, but anyway, enjoy. And please be free to ask me any questions that you like as we go. Buckle up, buttercake, says buckle up, buttercake, says Chelsea. Yeah, I like to have a laugh as well. Okay, now one of the models that many of you may have come across, and I love this model because it's a really interesting model about your learning as a leader, and of course the learning of anybody really. And this model is brilliant because it just explains a number of stages that we go through when we're learning anything. So whether it's leading a team or learning how to cook or learning to go to the gym or whatever it might be that you're into, any stage of any sort of source of learning goes through these particular stages. So if you look at the model on the right-hand side, you'll notice that the very first stage that every single one of us is in for a period of time is this stage called unconscious incompetent. Now, what does unconscious incompetent mean? Unconscious incompetent means we don't know that we don't know. So, for example, I'll use driving a car because I think most of us are familiar with the whole process of learning how to drive a car. So, when we're teenagers and we're just about ready to embark on our journey to get a license, before we've ever got behind a wheel, we are usually at the stage of unconscious incompetence. In other words, we actually think that driving a car is pretty simple. We might be quite critical of our parents, the way they drive, and we think it's just a matter of getting behind the wheel and off you go. That's our first stage. And I can recall being in that stage myself. So we kind of don't know that we don't know, which is stage one. And then what happens is that when we do get behind the wheel of a car and we do have the very first experience of driving, all of a sudden we realise that, hang on a minute, this isn't quite as easy as I thought. And in fact, I can recall backing back into a bush. I didn't cause too much damage to the car, but I, didn't put my foot on the brake, so to speak. So I actually all of a sudden realised that I was consciously incompetent, which is stage two. Now, consciously incompetent means we now know that we don't know. In other words, we have a realisation that this isn't actually quite as easy as we thought it would be. And we've all gone through that when we get behind the wheel of a car for the first time. We realise that, we've got to concentrate on steering. We've got to keep our eye every now and again in the rear vision mirror. We've got to, there's a whole bunch of things that we have to do in that early stages of learning how to drive a car. And we all of a sudden realise it isn't all that easy. So it becomes a little bit problematic for us all as such. So we learn that, and it's a very difficult process, more difficult than we think. Now, after a while, we get a few driving lessons, perhaps, or we get a bit of experience. We're about ready to go for our driving test, and what we get to is stage three, which is conscious incompetence. Conscious competence. So by concentrating hard and spending a bit of effort and getting some practice, we actually learn to be consciously competent. So in other words, we have to be concentrating all the time, and nevertheless, by concentrating in the early stages of driving, we actually learn after a while that this is actually something that can be done, although it's not that easy, and I really have to really concentrate to do it right. And that's usually where we get to when we qualify to get our driver's license. And so we're at that stage of conscious competence. We really have to keep concentrating. We have our P plates and L plates, and there is a transition period there where we have to really concentrate on what we're doing. Then after a period of time, maybe several years, we actually get to a stage where it kind of all comes together. So you could argue some people never get it together, but you know what I mean. It pretty much means that we learn how to, we don't have to, it's second nature. I guess that's another way of putting it. So that's the green stage there at the top, called unconscious competence. So in other words, we're competent, but being competent at this stage, the difference between conscious competence is that we actually don't have to spend all our time and energy concentrating. We learn through habit to look in the rear vision mirror. We learn to, the steering becomes a little bit easier. We don't have to, we can just give the wheel a little bit of a nudge and so forth. So that's the stage, of course, we all want to be in learning, because that's the stage that takes us to mastery. That is the stage that we need to be. So if you look at what you're learning here to become a better team leader, you're going through those stages, and I thought it might be appropriate, now that we're sort of getting to halfway through our Lunch and Learn series, to just explain that to you, to give you some context and to think about your own leadership. That, none of this is going to be easy to start with. And after a while, once you practice and get good at some of these skills, you will eventually get to that stage of unconscious competence, which means that you don't have to, it kind of is just second nature. So that's important. And all of you in this broadcast are unconsciously competent in your technical areas of what you do, I don't doubt. So it's kind of like second nature, and you just learn how to do it. So I just thought I'd share that with you before we went any further. So let's now talk about the concept of task and relationship. and just give you some indicators around that. One of the key themes out of today is this whole concept of keeping two balls in the air, and that is the balls of task and relationship. Obviously, we've all got a job to do, and that's the task. So whatever it might be, whether it's education or, whatever it might be, we actually need to achieve certain tasks and milestones. And it's quite possible that because you're in a leadership role, you may well be at that unconscious incompetent stage personally in terms of getting these tasks done. But on the other hand, you might be leading other people who are not at unconscious competence. So obviously you're required to coach those people and so forth and give them some tips and hints on how they might get to that stage. So look, the task is critically important, obviously. You can have the best relationships in the world with your team members, but if you don't get anything done, you're in trouble. Now, on the other end of the continuum, of course, you've got relationships. You don't get much done in terms of relationships if you don't have cooperation and trust and rapport with your team members. So you've got to maintain that on a regular basis, day by day, moment by moment, project by project. So those are the two variables that we're going to talk about today. And all the models I'm going to share with you have that in common, that it's always this juggling act between task and relationship. So it's really important that you keep that in mind. Now, it gets a bit complicated because what happens is that in certain situations that we're in, they become more task-focused and less relationship-focused by their very nature. So, for example, a health and safety issue is pretty primarily about task and making sure people follow certain safe work practices. That's all about the task. It's not got anything to do with the relationship. But on the other hand, relationship becomes really important and is more important than task. So, for example, you're inducting someone into a team. Probably your first call would be to try to build up some sort of a working relationship with the person. And so it's all about relationship. And then, of course, as they progress in your team, then you talk more and more about task. So different situations require an emphasis on either task or relationship. And of course, some, and quite a few actually, require both of those. So I just want you to keep that simple theme, or what might seem very simple, in the back of your mind as we go through some of these models, and just think about how they relate to the work that you do. All right, so another model that, before we get stuck into some of the other models, is that when you actually think about it, we can extend that a bit further. So up the top of this model, you can see tasks. So there we are. So you obviously have to get certain tasks done in certain time frames and with certain quality. So that's understood. But also, if you're looking at relationships, you could actually break those up into two subheadings or dimensions. There is the individual relationships that you have with each team member, and let's face it, some are probably more robust or better than others. Some may never be where you want them to be, and that's just because of all sorts of factors. They don't want necessarily a working relationship with you, or maybe vice versa. But but there's also another dimension to that relationship aspect, and that is the team. So when you have team meetings, when you meet together as a team, that's when the team relationship part is really important. So getting good at running meetings, making sure that you give everyone a say in the meeting, making sure that someone doesn't dominate the meeting, all of those sorts of things fall into the category of the team dimension. So you can actually split those up into two. So really, we're now at a stage where we've got three needs that we have to fulfill. There is the task need, the team need, and the individual need. And those three things are critically important. There's just a question here, from a couple of questions that I'll deal with now. Tim, is there another element here which is stakeholders and customers, or are they a broader aspect of the model? Yeah, of course, you've got stakeholders as well, and I guess we could put that around the model as well. And your stakeholders, of course, you could break that up into two, Chelsea. You could talk about internal stakeholders and you could talk about external stakeholders. So you can talk about that. You could break that up even further if you choose. So thank you for pointing that out. And Catherine says that a balancing act or a juggle, given we can't multitask. Yeah, you shouldn't be multitasking. I'm a big believer in that. You should just do one thing at a time. So I think, it depends on the situation and what sort of circumstances you're in. And I'm hoping that I can give you some sense-making tools around that today. So hopefully I can probably explain that a little bit further for you. All right, so let's go to the next slide, if I may. I'll just fill those out a bit. So you've got what we do, catering for individual needs and interests and motivations, and maintaining harmony and balance and collaboration. So those things, of course, are probably clearly understood. Now, the first model I want to share with you is a interesting model which is called the Managerial Grid, and it's one of the more simple models around this concept of people and task. So if you have a look at the model, which should be on your screen now. No, it's gone away now. There it comes. Gone away again. Okay, here it is. Stay there. Good. Now we've got it. So if you look over on the left-hand side, you can see a concern for people. So the concern for people is, of course, the relationship aspect. And you can see across the bottom, you've got concern for production, which really is the task. So that breaks the model up into 4 quadrants. There are a series of quadrants there, and it's a 2x2 matrix. And if you look at went too far there. If you look at the matrix, let's have a look at the key things there. So if you were achieving something, if you're a leader who is a high task focus and a low people focus by nature, you would be in the bottom right-hand corner, which is the task dimension. So a very task-focused manager. Now, some things require that. So, for example, if we're trying to meet deadlines that are critically important for other stakeholders that Chelsea had mentioned earlier, then obviously your style of leadership then is to get the task done, to get it done as quickly as possible. Why? Because we have a deadline that has to be met. And so therefore it would be appropriate in those circumstances to be very directional and making sure that things were done and that I's were dotted and T's were crossed. On the other hand, if we go to the other extreme, if you are very people-focused, right, and so and very low on task, you'd be in the top left-hand corner, which I love this title, which is the Country Club. Now, I'm not a member of a country club. Maybe you are, I don't know. But I would imagine that what happens in country clubs is very little. I think people would probably sit around and gossip and talk about all sorts of things, perhaps read a newspaper, have a coffee or whatever. It's all about relationships and it's all around networking. It's all around that sort of thing more so. I mean, I'm not suggesting that business isn't discussed, but it is primarily about that. So when would that be important? Well, where morale is low or where there's been some misunderstandings around certain tasks and you have to get the team together, or where there's been a bit of a conflict going on with a team member and you really don't want to talk about the task, but just try to build a better working relationship up with the person, you may gravitate to the country club quadrant, because that's the critically important thing there, to rebuild a relationship or to regroup and collect some understanding about where the other person's looking at the world from. Now, if you are in the bottom left-hand corner, this is what we call the impoverished quadrant. So it's low on people, concern for people, and it's low on concern for production. So this is a leader that really doesn't want to be a leader. And maybe if I gave you an example that maybe you have a reluctant technician in a lab. So you've got somebody working in a laboratory who happens to be the supervisor of, say, 4 other scientists, and they quite frankly really enjoy looking into the microscope, but they don't really enjoy anything. They don't enjoy the interaction with their colleagues, and they don't see their role as making sure other people are completing tasks on time. So they're a reluctant leader, basically. Now, you don't want to be in that space very often, but I could imagine that in certain circumstances where you've got a high level of maturity in your team, people are self-disciplined and they're getting on and getting the job done, and by interfering, it would not be productive. It's probably an example where you might be in that area, but you wouldn't want to be there too often, I wouldn't have thought. So the last one there is in the top right-hand corner, which is the team management quadrant. So this is high on concern for people and high on concern for production. Now you might say, surely that would be the ideal place to be. Not necessarily, because as I said before, certain situations require certain types of emphasis. So the best place to be, ironically, is right in the middle, which says the middle of the road. So where you can actually fluctuate depending on the person that you're dealing with or the situation you're dealing with. In other words, the task or the relationship. You can then flex and change and bring yourself into different categories depending on what's required at the time. That would probably be the best place to be. So that's the first model, and I'm going to share several of these sort of models because I want you to get your head around this whole juggling act of task and relationship and how it might impact on the work that you do. And I think what makes this more complex is that each of us are either have a predisposition towards people or tasks. It's our natural style. So if you have a predisposition towards people, then obviously the country club and the team management one is going to be an easier approach for you. Whereas if you're very task focused, it's probably likely that the task and the people management one will be easier for you. So you need to understand your shortcomings and some of the constraints that you have in terms of your own personal style. That makes a difference. Now, Kurt Lewin, who was a very famous management consultant in the last century, came up with leadership styles. In fact, he was the first one that came up with this, and he suggested that he suggested initially that there were 3 styles of leadership, and I'm going to run through those with you, and you can hopefully see them on your screen and just explain the circumstances where you might use these. His model became very popular, and lots of people liked the model because it was easy to understand. So let's go through it. Now you'll notice that on the left-hand side of the model, you've got the autocratic style of leadership. Now this is basically where the leader gives directives to their team members. And I can think, as I've said on the left-hand side, a classic example of this would be a military officer in a war zone. So we've got the enemy bombarding us, and frankly, we do not have time to collaborate. We do not have time to discuss strategy. We just need to do things quickly and safely, as safe as we can and as quickly as we can. So the ideal leadership style in that case, of course, is autocratic. Now, fortunately, none of us, I assume, in this broadcast is actually in that situation. And if you are, I feel sorry for you. But that would be when an autocratic style of leadership is very appropriate. Now, its great strength, of course, is that you can get stuff done really quickly because all you're really doing is giving directives, and if provided people respect you and provided people are prepared to follow you, then it's a good model in that sense. Because so any time that you're in a crisis, an emergency, any time that there is a situation where time pressure is absolutely of essence, it probably is appropriate for you to use an autocratic style. Now, you don't want to be using it all the time, but in certain circumstances, your followers will probably accept that that's a realistic way of leading. In fact, you could actually get, interesting enough, get criticised for not being autocratic in those circumstances, because people are crying out for direction. They need to know what the priorities are and how we might go about that. Now, the weakness of the model, of course, as you could probably work out, the weakness of the autocratic leader is, of course, if they're constantly barking out directions and orders, it's likely that the team are not really committed to the task at hand. In other words, there's not a lot of buy-in. They're only doing it because of fear or because you happen to be the boss. As soon as your back's turned, they're likely just to down tools and loaf. So, the leader has to be there, and the leader has to be very directive in order to get people to operate in that environment. So that's the weakness. So the power base that the autocratic leader uses, of course, is their hierarchical position. And that's why the military is very hierarchical, because it's based on the need to use autocratic leadership during times of crises, or during crises. Now, let's go right to the far side. On the other side, you've got democratic. Now, democratic leadership is probably the most acceptable form of leadership in our society. This is where you work with and through other people in order to make a decision. So this is where you consult other people. This is where you get their input. This is where you work through other people and make sense of what they're doing. Now, I wouldn't mind taking a bet that most of you would probably have a natural predisposition in that democratic style. So a good example of that would be a manager in a professional services firm, such as an accountancy or law firm or an engineering consultancy, where that manager is actually dealing with professionals who are pretty capable in terms of what they do. So the leader's style there is suited to basically setting timeframes, agreeing on project priorities, and that sort of thing. And so the weakness of it, of course, is that quick decisions cannot normally be made, because by nature of the democratic style, you are consulting with other people. And because you're consulting with other people, you need to have a conversation about it. And sometimes decisions can't be made very quickly. And sometimes people will actually be quite critical of that, because decisions can take sometimes days, weeks, months, depending on where you work or what you're experiencing. So the power base that's used for the democratic style of leader is fairness. If you can exhibit fairness to other people, then what it means is that other people will do things because they know that you're being fair and impartial. So obviously, if you are unfair, favouring other people and the rest of it, your ability to be a democratic style of leader is going to be diminished, because people will know that you're either favouring this person or that. So fairness is the critically important element for the democratic style of leader. Now, one of the most interesting ones is what Kurt Lewin called the laissez-faire style. Now, laissez-faire is the French word meaning free and easy. So laissez-faire style leadership is where the team makes the decision and ultimately keeps the leader informed as to what that decision is, right? So only where you're dealing with a highly technically competent team could you use laissez-faire leadership. So in other words, this is people keeping you informed and in the loop and for you to respond to that information when it's presented to you. And a good example of that is a judge in our legal system. So what happens is that a jury deliberates and makes decision on someone's guilt or innocence based on the evidence that's brought before the court. But ultimately, it is the judge who will sentence the person, assuming they're guilty, but they don't themselves make the decision of their guilt or innocence. They might guide and inform the jury on their duties and deliberations, but ultimately it is the jury that makes the decision. So that's a classic laissez-faire style of leadership. And the power base that the laissez-faire leader uses in those circumstances is they have expert knowledge, and so therefore that expert knowledge is important, that people can defer to the leader for advice, as a judge is often called upon to give advice to a jury. So depending on the nature of the work that you do, depending on the group of people that you lead, you may find that if you can, there might be times where you allow the team to make their own judgments, their own call, but to keep you informed. So that, the strength of this style of leadership is, of course, that the team has complete buy-in, complete autonomy to make, decisions. The weakness of it is that the leader themselves can sometimes be kept out of the loop because they're not always informed about what's going on, and that could be quite detrimental. So the weakness is the leader sometimes is separated from the team. And this is often the case when you have a head office and regional offices, and people in the regions make their decision and keep the leader at head office informed. And sometimes, of course, they don't inform them about the right things, and that can sometimes end in disaster. So Kurt Lewin's model is a very good model for that reason, that it just is very simple to understand. So the point here is that you should be all three in the right circumstances. And of course, if you go back to the task and relationship, autocratic is around task, laissez-faire is probably neither task nor relationship. It's that impoverished leadership style that I was talking about before. And democratic is a kind of a mix of task and relationship. All right, so the next model, and I won't go through this laboriously, this model, and if you've got any questions or comments, go for your life. We've probably all seen these kind of tables where you look at the difference between management and leadership. And it can be quite useful because obviously what we're trying to do in this Lunch and Learn series is get you to be more on the right-hand side, which is the idea of being a leader rather than a manager. I think you've probably got to be both, really, at the end of the day. But the point is, if you look at those distinctions between the left and the right, you'll notice that there's a difference between management and leadership. So, for example, if you look at the first one there, the manager administers and the leader innovates. So, so if you're, checking timesheets, or you are, making sure that milestones have been completed in a project, then obviously that would be a managerial task. But if you're talking to your people about ways and means of doing something faster or easier or with less friction, then it's likely that you're leading because you're attempting to try to innovate. So it's good to, and of course you'll get these slides later, it's good for you to go through the list and think, do I spend more time on the left-hand side or do I spend more time on the right-hand side? And I'm not suggesting for a minute that you shouldn't spend any time on the left-hand side. I think you should, because your organisation's got a whole lot of systems and processes and things that have to be done. But I would also suggest to you that you should be spending a fair percentage of your time on the right-hand side, and I'm hoping the Lunch and Learn series will give you some ideas about how to do that. That's certainly what I'm trying to encourage. So you might recall that this program is called the Lunch and Learn Team Leader series. So it's actually more inclined to be a right-hand side centric approach than the left-hand side. And so it's really important that you make that distinction in your own mind and to make sure that you're doing more of the things that are on the on the right-hand side. Now, another approach is Tannenbaum's approach, and I like this approach because if you look at what we covered with Kurt Lewin's autocratic, democratic, laissez-faire style, what Tannenbaum has done is he has broken that down even further. So it gives you a really nice framework to work with. So if you have a look at the model, it's pretty simple really, you've got here this blue space. If it's blue, I'm colorblind. Red and green, you've got here manager oriented, and you've got subordinate oriented. So over here on the left hand side, this is more dominated by the authority of the manager, and over on this side, there's more freedom for the team member to make their own decisions. All right, now again, the argument is that you should fluctuate across this scale depending upon what it is you're dealing with and who you're dealing with. But where I think this model is really valuable is down the bottom here, and it's got all these categories you see. So you can actually break up this model of autocratic, democratic, and laissez-faire into some subcategories. So, for example, let's just go through each of them and give you a bit of an idea. So starting on the left-hand side, you've got the manager takes decisions and announces it to the team. That's obviously an autocratic approach to leadership. So I make a decision in my own time, in my own way, and I make an announcement at the team meeting that this is going to be the decision. Now, in certain things such as policies, internal policies, compliance issues, safety issues, the sorts of things that are black and white and have to be followed and are part of the procedures of the organisation, that might well be appropriate. Now, as I move across, this one here is that the manager sells the decision. So essentially, it's still an autocratic approach. What I'm doing is I'm saying to people, now, this is the decision I've made, but this is the reason that I've made it. So now what I'm trying to do is sell the reason why I have made a decision that I have, not trying to justify it. It's more around selling it so that people actually walk away understanding why that decision's been made. All right, so those two are very much what Kurt Lewin would call autocratic. Now, if we go to the next couple, we're now moving into more of a democratic style of leadership. So the manager presents the decision with ideas and invites questions. So this is about getting feedback from the team. So this is at the high end of democratic in the sense that I'm ultimately probably going to make the decision, and I'm probably going to sell the reason for it, but I also believe that people will probably have questions that they want to ask in relation to the decision and why it was made, and I'm going to give people the freedom to ask those decisions. And then we move to manager suggests and the invites discussion. So this is about floating an idea. The yellow arrow there is about floating an idea at a team meeting and inviting discussion, but ultimately the leader will eventually make the decision based on the discussion and the feedback from the team meeting. And then the next one, which is a blue arrow, the manager presents a situation, gets suggestions, and then decides. So this is more around asking the team to come up with decisions. And then the green one says the manager explains, defines the parameters, and asks the team to decide. Now we're moving these last two into the laissez-faire style of leadership. So these two are really about the team coming up with the key points. They are the ones that ultimately make the decisions. The manager gives people the parameters and off they go. And the final one is the team allows team members to develop options and decide on actions. So a good example of the one over on the right-hand side might be where you might say, and I know not all of you do this, but let's say you're working in an environment where there were shift workers and somebody wanted to swap their shift for somebody else's shift. You might say to that person, well, look, why don't you go and talk to Fred or Mary in the other shift and see if you can swap? And I'll leave it to you two to decide. I'm perfectly happy for that to occur. We've got ourselves into a situation where the leader has asked the team member to go and consult with somebody else, and that, of course, would be a laissez-faire style of leadership. So that's a great model because it really breaks up Kurt Lewin's 3 styles into some subcategories. Okay, now we're getting towards the end, and if you've got any questions or comments or observations about any of these, please go ahead and type them in because I'm more than keen to respond to those. The next model, and this is the final model I wanted to share with you, is this model that I talked about at the beginning, which was the situational leadership model. Now, the situational leadership model has been around for a little while now, but it's still, I think, very current in the sense that it makes a lot of sense. The big value of this model compared with other models I've shared with you is the little box down the bottom, because the model is very much driven by the maturity of the team. So, think about the skill set that your team have. Think about the attitude and enthusiasm the team have. So the model here is driven by the enthusiasm and skill set of the team, and this dictates how you should lead them. So the argument is that this model, using this model, situational leadership, what you're attempting to do is to adjust your leadership style depending on where your team is at in terms of its level of maturity. So let's go over to the left-hand side here. You can see it's got D4. D4 says high competence, high commitment. So if people have got a high competence, in other words, they've got good technical skills, and they are very committed to achieving the goal, then it would be appropriate for you to delegate tasks to that team member or the team, because they have all the tools they need. They're competent, they know what they're doing, they're also very inspired by the task that they need to do, so motivation levels are high, so all you need to do is to delegate, and basically you can feel confident the team will run or the individual will run with what it is that they need to do. Now you might think to yourself, well, actually, that'd be a bit risky because I'm not sure my team's ready for that. And if that's the case, then you don't use it. But if you've got someone, let's say, who's extremely experienced, they might have had 20 years of experience doing what they're doing, they're very competent at what they do, and they're just a really good worker, they will appreciate the leadership style where you actually delegate to them. You could also spill into the supporting. You can see there up the top there in that orange area, that supporting area is, come to me if you've got any issues. I'm always here, my door's open if you've got a door, and more than happy for you to come and talk to me when you need to talk to me. So really, if you've got a highly competent individual or a highly competent team, and a highly competent team and a good attitude, then delegation and supporting would be the way to go. And you can see down the bottom in D3, this is people who have moderate to high competence, but they have varying commitment, so it can fluctuate. So I might have to, for example, encourage some people. Maybe they get discouraged about some stakeholder or something that's not being done. So I have to encourage them to do something different. And, that's going to require me supporting them because their commitment wanes depending on what it is that they're dealing with at the time. So if we go into the other two, which of course are D2 and D1, if you look at D2, for example, you've got low to some competence and low commitment, right? So this might be a case where it varies. You've got somebody really that you probably need to spend time with coaching. You need to spend time with them, giving them some clarity around what they do and how they go about their work. Maybe they're new to the team, and because they're new to the team, they don't know what's going on really. They don't know how to master tasks. They're not quite sure. They're actually at that stage of perhaps that they're at that stage of either unconscious incompetence or conscious incompetence. In other words, they know that they don't know. They might expect you to be spending time with them coaching them. So you can see that that would be an appropriate type of leadership for your team member when they're at that stage. Now, D1 is interesting because I just want to talk a little bit about millennials, and I get plenty of commentary, and I'm sure some of you are in that stage anyway in your career. You're probably millennials, but that people have to say, I just don't know how to deal with younger people and so forth. Well, let's understand this, that often, not always, there's a high degree of commitment, but there's a low competence. So this is like us when we start, first out driving a car. We're keen to get our license and all the rest of it. We're not really completely confident what we're doing, and that's why we have L and P plates. Your style of leadership in those cases needs to be quite directive. That might sound a bit strange, but why? Because these people sometimes don't know that they don't know. So now that doesn't mean aggressive. Don't think when I say directive, I'm talking about raising your voice and being quite, difficult. This is just about being clear and precise and, getting people to do specific tasks with time frames and so forth. That would be perfectly reasonable in those cases because their skill level is not high. They don't know. Maybe they don't know that they don't know, and they may resent you being quite directive, but the truth of the matter is that's actually quite appropriate at that stage of someone's career. And in fact, people who are new in the workplace and new to their career may expect their manager to be giving them a little bit more direction so that they can make their decision appropriately at the time. So this is a great model because it just basically says that you and I need to use different approaches depending on the level of maturity of the team member. Now you might say, well, hang on a minute, I've got people in my team who fluctuate right across the scale from developed to developing. As you see down the bottom, that little label. And so therefore what that means is that you've got to have a more flexible style depending on who you're dealing with in your team at that particular time. So for one person you might delegate because you know they can do it, but for another person you might be quite directive because you know that they don't know. So they need clear directions around how they actually complete the task. So what I'm trying to do in this short hour is basically say to you, you need to be flexible in how you do things, because if you're not, you'll find that you will be less effective. We've just got a question here from Chelsea. Tim, any suggestions on how to manage people who don't know that they are unconsciously competent or even mastery? Is it a case of coaching and supporting or letting them know it's something you see in them that they don't see in themselves? Great question again. if people are, remember, I'll come back to the analogy of driving the car. You know, when you're driving, when you first get behind the wheel, we all think it's a piece of cake, don't we? That's what you're talking about, Chelsea. You're talking about people actually thinking that they're ready to go when they're not. How did we actually learn to go from unconscious incompetent to conscious incompetent? How did we actually know to go from A to B? Well, it happened because we got some experience. We were actually aware that we couldn't do it properly. And so all of a sudden, our whole attitude to the task changed. So it's the same in the workplace. Ironically, it's not about giving people a lecture, because remember, they're at that unconscious stage. So we've got to help people fail safe. So we've got to actually help people to have an experience that's not going to be a disaster in the workplace, that will give people a chance to say, okay, I've got something I've got to learn here. You see, so that's actually how people learn. That's how you learn. That's how I learn. We all learn that way. So we've got to try and find opportunities for people to fail safe. And Kathy asks, can people swing between D4 and D1 depending on the task, less enthusiastic about the tasks? Yeah, fantastic observation, Catherine. Yes, of course. And so that's why it becomes quite complicated. What it means is that you can't generalize and say everybody in your team is in one of those categories at the bottom of the model. They will vary. So it really means that you've got to be astute and watch and think and adjust your leadership style depending on the circumstances. Absolutely. Sorry, Chelsea, I missed your point there. You're saying, no, I'm not talking about people not being confident in their ability. You're talking about people who, you'll have to explain that a bit more to me. I've lost the thread there. Just while you might be typing that in, just have a think about that, and just that'll be good. I'm not quite sure what you're asking me there. The other point is you can send something to me offline if you like. Stephen asked the question, what was the question about unconsciously competent people? Okay, you're just trying to clarify that, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Chelsea. I've had a brain snap or something there. I haven't quite picked up on your key point that you're trying to make. So maybe you might be busily trying to send that through to me. So do that. That would be great. Here we go. Managing people who do not realise that they are masters of the task and feel that they are consciously competent. Oh, right. Okay. Look, it's about supporting. Okay. In those circumstances, it's about you giving people a sense of confidence about their ability to do the task. There are lots of people who are quite good at what they do, but they don't realise that they're good at what they do. So if you look at the model, then it would be a supporting type of leadership where you actually have to demonstrate to the person that they are, in fact, very good at what they do and that they can be trusted to get the job done. But there are other factors that get involved in all that, of course, and that is that, people don't want to take the responsibility if anything goes wrong and all the rest. That's true. But okay, so thanks, Chelsea. It looks like I nailed it. Thank you, finally. Cheers. All right, let's just finish up what we're doing. So look, the key message in all this is pretty straightforward, although not so easy to do. And that is be flexible in your leadership approach. And what it means is if plan A doesn't work, try and move to a plan B. But don't be stuck in your natural style, and we've all got a natural style. Just try to use different approaches for different people and different situations. All right? So guess what? Yeah, homework. Yep. Take time to consider one of these approaches, and I want you to apply it. So I really want you in the next fortnight to really concentrate on flexing your approach. So just one of those models would have resonated with you, I hope. So just take the model and just start thinking to yourself, righto, for today, I'm going to try and be as flexible as I probably can be with the people I deal with and the tasks I have to do. And I'm just going to experiment with this and try some things out. And by all means, you're quite within your rights to send me an email, tell me your war stories and what's happening. Did it work? And if it didn't work, perhaps why not? So I want you to try these things in your team, and that will strengthen your ability to lead your team, which is ultimately what this whole Lunch and Learn series is about. So, folks, that's it. We're done. I look forward to seeing you for Unit 4 in 2 weeks, which is the roles people play in teams. So I'll go through that with you. I won't preempt that at this stage. And as I've said before, you are quite within your rights to send me emails. I actually quite welcome that. And if you want to ask me questions or, as I said before, tell me some of the war stories that you're going through, then that's great. Thanks, Tim. You're amazing, and this is so useful to both me and my team. Thank you, Chelsea. That's very kind of you to say that, and it's always reassuring to hear that. Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Tracy. That's nice feedback. Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Wish you all the best. Don't forget, love the models. Thanks, Catherine. Thank you. Yeah, just get in and give it a good go. Give it a good shake. So that's it from me, and I wish you all the very best, and look forward to have a great weekend. And this afternoon, try your situational leadership. Thank you and goodbye.